First contact with a human warship left the galaxy in silent awe. The galaxy had been quiet for a long time. Not quiet in the way of empty space, where there is nothing but cold and dark and distance. Quiet in the way of a place where the rules are already written, where everyone knows their place, and where nothing truly surprising has happened in a very long time. The Galactic Conclave had existed for 11,000 years. It had seen wars, plagues, the birth of new stars, and the death of old ones. It had watched species rise and fall. It had written laws, broken them, rewritten them, and called itself wise. By its own measure, it was. There were 7 elder races in the conclave. The Vreth were the oldest of the active members, cold, precise beings made of something between crystal and thought, who managed the deep space communication relays with the care of surgeons. The Soruan were tall and four-armed and traded across every known lane with a patience that other species admired and sometimes resented. The Okali were so old that most of the other races spoke about them in whispers, not from fear, but from something closer to reverence. The Okali rarely spoke. When they did, everyone listened. Together with 4 younger races, these 7 formed the conclave, a body of shared law, shared space, and shared survival. They were not always friends. But they had agreed, long ago, that the alternative to agreement was destruction, and none of them wanted that. For 11,000 years, this arrangement had held. There was a small yellow star near the outer rim of the galaxy. It had 8 planets. The conclave's survey probes had visited the system a few centuries back, logged it, and moved on. The 3rd planet was wet and warm and covered in life, a very common thing in the galaxy. Life was not rare. Interesting life was rarer, but even that was not unheard of. The dominant species on that 3rd planet walked on 2 legs, had soft skin, and had only recently, by galactic reckoning, managed to leave their own atmosphere in small metal canisters powered by burning chemicals. The conclave's survey team had noted them, given them a classification number, and recommended a check-in visit in approximately 200 years. Maybe 300. There was no rush. Soft-skinned bipeds who burned chemicals for propulsion were not going anywhere important anytime soon. That was the general feeling. That feeling ended on the 43rd day of the cycle of Rune. A Vreth listening station at the rim of the galaxy picked up a gravitational signature. The station's automated systems flagged it immediately, because the signature was not natural. Natural gravitational shifts happened all the time, stars moved, black holes pulled, the fabric of space breathed in long, slow rhythms. But this signature was sharp and clean and came and went in less than a second, which meant only one thing. Something had used fold space to travel. Fold space travel was not simple. It required an understanding of physics that took most species centuries to develop. It required machines of enormous complexity. It required materials that were difficult to find and harder to shape. Every race in the conclave remembered the long years of study and failure and small progress before their first fold drive worked correctly. It was a milestone. It was, in many ways, the moment a species truly became part of the galaxy. The signal from the rim station reached Fleet Commander Sereth of the Soruan 3 hours later. She was on the bridge of her command vessel, reviewing trade route updates, when her navigator set the report in front of her. She read it once. She read it again. Then she asked her navigator to run the origin trace a second time, because she was quite certain that someone had made an error. The navigator ran it again. The result was the same. The fold space signature had originated from the 3rd planet of the Sol system, the wet, warm, unremarkable world with the soft-skinned bipeds who were supposed to be nowhere near this kind of technology for at least another 2 centuries. Sereth stared at the data for a long time. Then she quietly sent a priority signal to every conclave vessel within 6 light years and told them to change course. The word spread fast. In the galaxy, news of a new fold-capable species always spread fast. It was the kind of event that changed things, and everyone in the conclave had lived long enough to understand that change was something you paid attention to. Within a day, 31 vessels had gathered at the edge of the Vethra Nebula, hanging in space at a distance the Vreth tactical analysts had determined was safe, far enough to leave quickly if needed, close enough to observe clearly. The Okali, who had not sent a representative to anything in over a century, quietly dispatched Elder Myun, which told every other race present that this was being taken seriously. The object they had come to observe sat at the edge of the nebula like something that had always been there and simply decided to let itself be seen. It was not the largest thing any of them had ever seen. Conclave vessels came in many sizes, and some of them were enormous, city ships and carrier platforms and deep space stations that dwarfed most natural objects. By those standards, the human vessel was small. But size was not what held everyone's attention. It was the shape. Every spacefaring race built ships that reflected something about who they were. The Sauruan ships were long and curved, built for grace and speed. The Vreth ships were geometric, precise, and symmetrical in the way of things designed by minds that found beauty in mathematics. The Okali ships were ancient and strange and looked less like built things and more like grown ones, as if the galaxy itself had shaped them over millennia. The human vessel was none of these things. It was angular. Every surface was flat or angled sharply, with no unnecessary curves, no decoration, no ornamentation of any kind. Its hull was dark and had been scorched in places, not by weapons, the analysts confirmed quickly, but by the heat of its own engines during acceleration. It had thick plating along its sides that was clearly not there for appearance. It had structures on its surface that the Vreth analyst Korath-7 identified after some study as weapons, many of them, arranged in overlapping fields so that almost no angle of approach was uncovered. It was, Korath-7 said in his report, the most deliberately dangerous shape he had ever seen a vessel take. And it was sitting there, in open space, not hiding, not fleeing, not powering its weapons. Just sitting. Waiting. As if it had known they would come, had expected them to come, and had decided that waiting was the correct response. The letters on its hull were readable through long-range optical sensors. The Conclave's translation systems worked quickly on any written language once they had a sufficient sample, and the human vessel's markings gave them enough. The ship's name resolved first. USNS Resolute. Then the line beneath it, smaller but clear. We come in peace. We are prepared for the alternative. Commander Sareth read it twice. She thought about the weapons Korath-7 had catalogued. She thought about the fact that this species had developed fold space travel 2 centuries ahead of any projection. She thought about the particular stillness of the vessel in front of her, no aggressive movement, no retreat, just a calm and total readiness that felt less like a greeting and more like a statement. Nobody in the fleet laughed at the inscription. It did not feel like something to laugh at. Sareth took a long breath. Then she reached forward and opened a communication channel, because protocol required it, and also because she found, to her own surprise, that she genuinely wanted to know what the soft-skinned bipeds had to say for themselves. The channel opened. She waited. On the other side of 30,000 kilometers of empty space, someone on the Resolute answered, #First contact with a human warship left the galaxy in silent awe. The face that appeared on Commander Sareth's screen was calm. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the features, though the face was strange to her eyes, flat and pink and framed by short gray-brown hair, but the expression. She had made first contact with 3 species in her career. All 3 had shown the same thing in those first moments, excitement, or fear, or a combination of both that made beings move too fast and speak too quickly. First contact was an overwhelming experience. Even the most composed diplomat trembled a little when meeting a new form of intelligent life for the first time. The man on the screen did not tremble. He did not look excited or afraid. He looked the way a person looks when they are doing something they have thought about for a very long time and have finally gotten the chance to do. There was patience in his face, and attention, and something else that Sareth's translator could not immediately classify, a kind of settled readiness that was not aggression but was not far from it either. He spoke first, which surprised her. Protocol in every known civilization dictated that the side with more vessels opened the channel. Her fleet outnumbered his ship 31-1. He should have waited. He did not wait. "Commander," he said, in the Conclave's trade tongue, with an accent that was imperfect but clear. "I'm glad you reached out. It saves time." The bridge of Sareth's vessel went very quiet. The Conclave's trade tongue was not an easy language. It had been built over centuries by combining elements of 3 different species communication systems, and even experienced diplomats sometimes struggled with its tonal structures. The man on her screen spoke it the way someone speaks a language they have studied for years in private, not fluently, not perfectly, but with the confidence of someone who has put in the work and knows it. You speak our language, Sareth said, because she could not think of anything else to say in that moment. We have been listening to your relay transmissions for about 60 years, he said. We are patient when we need to be. 60 years. Sareth kept her expression steady, but beside her, she heard her navigator make a small sound. 60 years was nothing to species that lived for centuries. But 60 years of listening in secret, of recording and studying and learning without ever making themselves known, that was not patience. That was discipline of a kind that was genuinely rare. The man's name, he told her, was Daniel Howe. He was the captain of the Resolute. He gave her this information simply, without ceremony, as if they were two people meeting on a street corner rather than across 30,000 kilometers of space with a fleet of warships in between. Sareth's eyes moved past him as he spoke. The bridge of the Resolute was visible behind his shoulder, and she studied it the way she studied everything, carefully, without appearing to. It was compact. Low ceilings. Everything built close together, as if space aboard the vessel had been considered precious and not a single meter of it had been wasted. The lighting was practical and flat. There were no decorative elements visible. Every surface that was not a workstation was a storage unit or a panel of some kind. And the crew? She counted 11 from what she could see. They were all moving, but not with urgency, with the steady, purposeful rhythm of people doing routine work. One young woman at a station to the captain's left was running what was clearly a detailed scan of Sareth's fleet. She did it with the same expression a person might use to sort documents. Her name tag was readable through the screen, Lieutenant Carrie Odom. Lieutenant Odom was not afraid either. On the private channel in Sareth's earpiece, Vreth Analyst Karath 7 spoke in a low, careful voice. I have completed my structural analysis of the vessel, he said. The weapons systems I identified earlier are only the exterior-mounted units. Based on energy signatures and hull geometry, there are additional systems inside the ship that I cannot fully profile from this distance. The vessel has been designed so that its full armament is not visible from outside. Sareth did not react to this. She kept her eyes on Daniel. You are aware, she said to him, that you are significantly outnumbered. 31-1, Daniel said. He nodded once, as if confirming a calculation he had already done. We counted. He paused for exactly 1 second. Should we be worried? The question landed on the bridge like something solid. Sareth was aware of every pair of eyes on her crew turning toward her, then quickly turning away again, because they were professionals and professionals did not stare. But she felt it. The honest answer was, he probably should be. 31 vessels against 1, in open space, with no allies and no backup, any reasonable being would treat that as a serious threat. But Daniel Howe had asked the question with the tone of a man who was genuinely curious about the answer, not a man who was frightened by the odds. In her earpiece, Elder Mune of the Okali spoke. The elder's translated voice was slow and deliberate, like stones settling. This is not an explorer vessel, Mune said. You understand that. This is a warship. And its captain is comfortable. I see that, Sareth said quietly. The question is why, Mune said. A single warship, facing 31 vessels, does not show comfort unless one of two things is true. Either the captain is not very intelligent, or the captain has already considered the worst outcome and decided it is acceptable. Sareth looked at Daniel Howe's face on the screen and thought that the first option was very unlikely. She proposed formal negotiations. Daniel agreed without attaching any conditions to his agreement. This confused the conclave diplomatic team, who had prepared extensively for a long process of establishing ground rules and mutual conditions. The absence of conditions was, in its own way, more unsettling than a list of demands would have been. A delegation was arranged for the following day. 6 beings, 4 species, would board the Resolute for an initial meeting. Daniel accepted this without hesitation and offered to send over a layout of the ship so the delegation would not get lost. When the channel closed, the bridge of Sareth's vessel stayed quiet for a moment. Her first officer, a young Sauruan named Vel, was the first to speak. He already knew our language, she said. He knew it before he came here. That means they planned this. They chose this moment. Yes, Sareth said. They are not new to this, Vel said. They came prepared. Sareth looked at the image of the Resolute on her display. The ship sat in the same position it had held since it arrived, perfectly still, perfectly patient. No aggressive movement. No retreat. Just that quiet, total readiness that she was already beginning to think of as distinctly human. No, she agreed. They are not new to this. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a species that built a ship like that, crewed it with people like that, and then sailed it into unknown space to meet strangers it had never seen before, that was a species that had spent a very long time preparing for something. The question that stayed with her for the rest of the day was simple. What exactly had they been preparing for? First contact with a human warship left the galaxy in silent awe. The shuttle that carried the conclave delegation to the Resolute was small and slow, and the 6 beings inside it were very quiet for most of the journey. Vel, the young Sauruan diplomat who had been chosen as first contact liaison, sat near the front and watched the human ship grow larger through the viewport. She had spent most of the previous night reviewing everything the conclave knew about the Sol system and its dominant species. There was not much. Old survey data. Broad-range atmospheric scans. A few decades of intercepted electromagnetic signals that the conclave's archivists had filed away without much interest. She had read all of it. It had not prepared her for the size of the ship as they approached it, or for the way the ship looked up close, every surface deliberate, every angle intentional, the whole of it carrying the particular weight of something built by people who were not interested in appearances. Korath 7 of the Vreth sat behind her and said nothing. He was processing. She could tell by the faint hum his crystalline body produced when its internal systems were working hard. The Okali elder Myun had not come in person. Myun was present through a small device clipped to Vel's collar, a relay that allowed the elder to observe and speak quietly when needed. This was unusual. Most diplomats would have found it uncomfortable, being observed so closely. Vel had decided to treat it as an honor. The Resolute's docking bay opened for them smoothly. The doors were thick, very thick, Vel noticed, and moved with a slow, heavy precision that told her the mechanism behind them was powerful. The bay itself was clean and well lit. 2 human crew members were waiting when the shuttle settled. They were both young, both stood straight, and both wore the dark uniform she had seen on the captain. One was a man, broad across the shoulders, with a careful and watchful face. His name tag said Corporal Pete Galvin. The other was a woman with very short hair and quick, intelligent eyes. Her tag said Ensign Dana Kirsch. Neither of them smiled in the way of beings who are nervous and trying not to show it. They smiled in the way of people who are simply pleased to have something interesting happen on an ordinary day. "Welcome aboard the Resolute," Pete said, in the trade tongue, with a better accent than Vel had expected from an enlisted crew member. "The captain is waiting." They walked through corridors that were built for human proportions, which meant they were a little narrow for Vel and considerably low for Korath 7, who had to angle his upper crystalline structures to avoid contact with the ceiling. Neither Pete nor Dana seemed concerned by this. They adjusted their pace and said nothing about it. The first thing Vel noticed was the weapons. Not hidden, not locked away, not behind secured panels that required authorization to open, just there, in plain sight. Every crew member they passed wore a sidearm at their hip as naturally as they wore their boots. And along the corridor walls, every 20 meters or so, there were storage lockers clearly marked with symbols that the translation algorithm identified as emergency weapons access points. These were not ceremonial. These were functional. These were the markings of a crew that had been trained to know exactly where the nearest weapon was at any given moment and to reach it quickly if they needed to. It was not threatening, Vel decided after thinking about it. It was simply honest. The Resolute was a warship. Its crew were soldiers. They were not pretending otherwise. The second thing she noticed was the crew themselves. They passed perhaps 30 people in the corridors on the way to the main conference room. All of them made brief eye contact with the delegation, gave a small nod, and returned to what they were doing. No one stared. No one stopped. There was no whispering or pointing or the barely contained excitement that Vel had seen in her own species when encountering something new. These people were curious, she could see that, but their curiosity was calm. It was under control, the way everything aboard this ship seemed to be under control. In the medical bay, visible through an open door, a woman in a slightly different uniform was doing maintenance work on a large piece of equipment. Her name tag read Lieutenant Commander Laura Finch, and the equipment she was working on was clearly medical, but built for speed and severity, with features that Vel recognized from battlefield medicine protocols. The kind of equipment that did not assume a patient had time to wait. Dana caught Vel looking. "That's Doc Finch," she said simply. "She's always doing something. She maintains the medical bay personally." Vel asked. "She says if she doesn't know exactly how every piece of it works, she can't use it fast enough when it matters," Dana said. "Most of the crew are like that." Vel thought about that as they continued walking. Captain Daniel Howe was waiting in the conference room at the end of the main corridor. He was standing, not sitting, when they entered, standing and looking at a large printed map mounted on the wall, a map of what Vel recognized as the Sol system, with marks and notes written across it in human script. He turned when they came in, and his expression was the same as it had been on the screen the day before, open, attentive, completely unhurried. He greeted each member of the delegation individually. He used their names and their correct titles, which he had clearly prepared ahead of time. With Karath 7 he used the formal Vreth acknowledgement rather than the standard trade tongue greeting, which made the analyst go still for a moment in the way that meant he was surprised. They sat. They talked. Daniel answered every question directly. He did not hedge, did not soften, did not use the circular careful language of experienced diplomats who are trained to say things that sound clear but commit to nothing. When Vel asked him why humanity's first interstellar vessel was a warship rather than a science or exploration vessel, he looked at her for a moment and then said, "We wanted to be honest about what we are." The room was quiet after that. "And what are you?" Karath 7 asked. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "A species that learned most of what it knows from surviving things that should have killed it," he said. "We thought it was better to arrive prepared than to arrive and wish we had been." Myun's voice came softly through Vel's collar device. "Ask him how long they have been in space." Vel asked. "Crude orbital flight, about 80 years, Daniel said. Permanent orbital presence, 60 years. Lunar operations, 50. Our first fold drive test was 11 years ago. This is our third fold-capable vessel." He paused. "We lost the first two." "In accidents?" Vel asked. "In tests," he said. We kept going. Near the end of the meeting, Daniel stood and said he would like to show the delegation the rest of the ship, if they were willing. No one refused. The tour was thorough and completely unfiltered. Daniel walked them through the engine room, where two engineers, a quiet young man named Kyle Tran and an older woman named Chief Rita Boone, worked without looking up, because the engines apparently required that level of attention at all times. He walked them through the crew quarters, small and efficient and personal in the small ways that soldiers everywhere make places their own, photographs, small objects, handwritten notes taped to bunks. And he walked them through the weapons bay. He did not apologize for it. He did not explain it away or frame it carefully. He walked them through it the way a man walks a guest through his home, clearly, openly, without shame. Railguns. Energy weapons. Sealed bays that held something that Karath 7 calculated, quietly, could crack the crust of a small moon if used correctly. "You built all of this," Karath 7 said slowly, "before meeting any other species." Daniel looked at him. "Yes." "Why?" the analyst asked. Daniel's answer was quiet and took only a few words, but it moved through the delegation like a current and none of them forgot it. "Because we had already met each other." Nobody spoke again for a long time after that. They stood in the weapons bay of a ship built by a species that had spent 10,000 years fighting itself, and they understood, perhaps for the first time, what that actually meant. First contact with a human warship left the galaxy in silent awe. After the tour, Vel did not go back to the shuttle with the rest of the delegation. She had asked, carefully and politely, the way diplomats ask things they are not entirely sure they should ask, whether she might stay aboard the Resolute for a few hours to continue her initial observations. Daniel had looked at her for a moment with that steady, measuring attention of his and then said yes without any conditions. He assigned Ensign Dana Kirsch to stay with her, not as a guard, she understood, but as a guide, and that distinction felt important. The rest of the delegation returned to the conclave fleet. Vel stayed. She spent those hours simply moving through the ship and watching. There was something about the Resolute that she could not stop thinking about, and it took her a long time to understand what it was. The ship was not comfortable. That was the first part of it. Everything was built for function rather than ease, and the humans aboard it lived accordingly. The bunks were narrow. The common areas were small. The food, she did not eat any, but she observed it being prepared and served, was plain and practical. There were no luxuries. The Soruan warships she had served on had gardens. They had spaces designed for rest and reflection, because Soruan command doctrine held that a crew who could not find peace aboard a vessel would not make good decisions under pressure. The Resolute had none of that. And yet the crew was not unhappy. She could see it clearly. They moved with energy. They talked to each other in short bursts of language that she was only beginning to follow, full of references and shorthand and humor that she could not quite catch, and when they laughed it was quick and real. They were at home here, in this tight, efficient, heavily armed space. Not despite its hardness, but somehow because of it. Chief Rita Boone found Vel standing in the engine room corridor and staring at nothing in particular. Boone was older than most of the crew, with gray at her temples and grease on her hands that did not appear to bother her. She looked at Vel the way a person looks at a puzzle they have seen before but found interesting anyway. "You're trying to figure us out," Boone said. Not unkindly. "Yes," Vel said. There was no point in being indirect about it. Boone wiped her hands on a cloth tucked into her belt. "What have you gotten so far?" Vel thought about it. "Your ship is built to fight," she said. "Your crew has been trained to handle situations that most species would consider extreme. And none of you find any of this unusual." "No," Boone said. "We don't." "Why not?" Boone was quiet for a moment. "You know how long humans have been having wars?" "A long time," Vel said. "Your history suggests continuous organized conflict for at least 10,000 years. "Right," Boone said. "So here's the thing. We didn't come out here because we're peaceful. We're not, really, not naturally. We came out here because we finally got good enough at managing ourselves that we had energy left over to look outward." She glanced toward the engine room door. "We didn't stop being what we are. We just gave it a bigger direction." Vel thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Dana took her to the officers' mess for what the crew called the end-of-shift gathering, not a formal meal, just a time when people collected in the same room and were briefly in the same place before returning to their duties. There were 12 people there when Vel entered, and all of them looked at her with the same calm, open curiosity she had seen all day. A young man named Corporal Nick Adler offered her a seat with a small nod. A woman named Sergeant Gail Marsh moved a mug to make space on the table. Nobody made a speech. Nobody stared. They simply made room. On the wall above the table there was a photograph, printed large and framed in plain dark metal. It showed a planet from orbit, blue and green and white, half in shadow, impossibly beautiful in the way that all living planets were. Beneath it, in human script, were words that Dana translated quietly for her. "Remember what we're protecting." Vel stood and looked at it for a long time. She had seen many things like it on conclave vessels, images of homeworlds, symbols of belonging. But there was something different about this one. It was not decorative. It was not ceremonial. It had the feeling of something placed there with a very specific purpose, to be looked at when things were hard and the answer to the question, "Why are we doing this?" was not immediately clear. "They put that there intentionally," she said to Dana. "The captain put it there," Dana said. "Day the ship launched. He wanted the crew to remember why they left," Vel said. "He wanted them to remember what they'd come back to," Dana said. "Those are different things." Vel thought they were probably both right. She returned to the fleet that evening with 4 pages of notes and a feeling she could not entirely organize into language. She sat in her small cabin on Saratha's command vessel and tried to write a preliminary report and found that every time she began, she stopped again, because the things she most wanted to say were the things that were hardest to explain. The humans were not gentle. That was the simplest truth. Their ship was a weapon. Their crew were warriors. Their history was long and bloody and full of the kind of violence that made other species' conflicts look modest. They had come to the edge of known space armed and ready, and their captain had looked at 31 conclave vessels without the slightest visible fear. But they had put a photograph of their planet on the wall of their mess hall and written under it that they were protecting it. They made room at the table for strangers without being asked. Their doctor maintained her own equipment because she needed to be fast when someone was hurt. Their engineer talked about her species' history of war not with pride or regret, but with the plain honesty of someone who has made peace with a complicated truth. Vel wrote in her report, "They are not like us. They do not want to be like us. They have not come here to join us, they have come here to meet us, which is not the same thing. They are bringing something with them that the conclave has not seen before, and I do not yet have a word for what it is. But I believe it is important." She sent the report to Commander Sareth and then sat in the dark for a while, thinking about a photograph on a wall and a woman who kept her surgical equipment maintained so she could use it faster when the moment came. She was beginning to understand, slowly, what Daniel Howe had meant when he said they had come prepared. They had not come prepared for the conclave. They had come prepared for anything. They had spent 10,000 years making themselves ready for every worst possible outcome, and now they had arrived in the galaxy with all of that preparation still intact, not as aggression, but as simple, quiet, total readiness. It was, Vel thought, the most human thing she had seen all day. And she had been seeing it since the moment she first stepped through the doors of the docking bay. #first contact with a human warship left the galaxy in silent awe. The conclave's full session was called on the third day after first contact, and every elder race sent someone. That alone was enough to tell the younger species in the conclave that this was not ordinary. Full sessions were rare. Full sessions with all 7 elder races present had not happened in over 3 centuries. The session chamber, a vast, domed space at the center of the conclave's oldest station, filled slowly, the way all important rooms fill, with the quiet and careful movement of beings who understand that what is about to be discussed will matter for a long time. There was no human representative present. The session was about them, not with them. That was standard. New species were observed and discussed before they were invited in. The humans almost certainly knew this, Commander Sareth reflected as she took her seat. They had been listening for 60 years. They probably knew the protocol better than some of the junior conclave members in the room. The session opened. The debate began. It was long. 9 days, in the end, which was not unusual for the conclave's most significant decisions. There were voices that called the human arrival a threat. There were others who called it an opportunity. The Vreth presented detailed analyses of the Resolute's weapons systems, laid out in precise technical language that left no room for comfortable reassurance. The ship was capable, the analysts said, of doing serious damage to a conclave fleet if used offensively, and its design suggested that whoever built it had thought carefully about that possibility. The Soruan Trade Council wanted to know about resources and routes. The 2 smaller races, the Peth and the Dorial, said very little, as they often did in sessions where the elder races were speaking, but their silence had a quality of attentiveness that suggested they were listening to everything. Vel gave her report on the second day. She stood in the center of the chamber and spoke for an hour without notes, because the things she wanted to say were not the kind of things that benefited from notes. She talked about the photograph on the wall. She talked about Chief Boone in the engine corridor. She talked about the weapons lockers every 20 meters, and the way the crew wore their sidearms without thinking about it, the way someone wears a watch, not because they are expecting to need it every moment, but because the habit of being ready had become simply part of who they were. The chamber was quiet while she spoke. Karath 7 had already submitted his technical report. The Elder Mun had sent a written observation that had been read to the session on the first day. But Vel's account was different from both of those things, because Vel had sat in the mess hall with the crew of the Resolute and been offered a seat at the table without ceremony, and that was the kind of information that technical analyses did not capture. "I want to be careful," she said near the end, "not to make them sound like something they are not. They are not peaceful. Their history is not peaceful. The vessel they sent here was not chosen randomly, it was chosen deliberately, and its design communicates something deliberate. They wanted us to see, from the first moment, that they were not helpless." She paused and looked around the chamber at the many faces, crystalline, tall, ancient, young, watching her. But they also put a photograph of their home on the wall of the room where their crew eats together, with words underneath it about protection. And when they had the chance to close their doors to us, they opened them instead. Every door. They showed us everything. Not because they had to. Because they chose to. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. It was the Okali Elder Mun who gave the session its direction, on the 8th day, as she had given the direction to many sessions over the centuries. Mun rose from her seat, a slow process, because the Okali did not move quickly, but the room gave her all the time she needed, and spoke in her own language, which was translated in real time for every species present. "We made an error," Myun said. "Not a small one. We looked at the third planet of a yellow star and we decided what we saw. We did not ask what the violence of that world was teaching its people. We saw creatures fighting and we called them primitive. We did not consider that a species which survives its own nature for 10,000 years and then builds something like the Resolute is not primitive. It is something else entirely." She paused. "They came here without fear. Not because they are foolish. Because they have already survived the thing that frightened them most, and it was not us. It was themselves. They have faced and survived and persisted through every terrible thing their world could produce, and they are still here, and they came to the stars not running from something but moving toward it." She was quiet for a moment. "There is something in them that we do not have a word for. I have been trying to find the word for 3 days. I believe it is the thing that makes a being go forward when going back would be easier and safer and no one would blame them for it." The session's final vote was not close. Full contact. Full recognition. The humans of Sol System would be invited to observe the Conclave's next formal session as provisional members, pending a period of mutual understanding that the Conclave's legal team estimated at approximately 5 years. Vel was asked to draft the message. The committee of 12 assigned to the task met for 2 days and produced a document that was thorough and correct and, she felt, entirely wrong in its tone, careful and formal and diplomatic in every word, the way Conclave documents always were, built by people who had spent lifetimes learning how to say things without quite saying them. She sent her own version without asking for approval, because she had been aboard the Resolute and she knew that Daniel Howe would see through careful language immediately, and she did not want the first real message humanity received from the galaxy to be dishonest. Her version was short. "You surprised us. That has not happened in a very long time. We would like to know you better." She sent it, then sat back and waited. The reply came in 4 hours. Daniel Howe's voice, in the trade tongue, clear and simple. "We accept. We have been waiting for someone to say that." On the bridge of the Resolute, Daniel set down the message and stood at the observation window for a while. The stars were dense out here at the rim, more crowded than they looked from Earth. He had grown up looking at a night sky that was bright with them, wondering what was out there, whether any of it was looking back. Something had been looking back. Something had been watching and deciding and ultimately reaching out with 7 words that were so plain and honest that they cut through all the ceremony of 11,000 years of galactic civilization like a signal through static. They had surprised it. He liked that. Lieutenant Carrie Odom appeared in the doorway behind him. "The crew wants to know if there's news, Captain." He turned from the window. "Tell them we're staying," he said. "And tell them that in about 5 years, if things go well, humanity is going to have a seat in the oldest governing body in the galaxy." Odom smiled, the real kind, not the professional kind. "And if things don't go well?" Daniel picked his jacket up from the back of the nearest chair. "Then we'll handle that too," he said. "That's what we're good at." He walked back toward the bridge. Behind him, the stars waited, and the galaxy that had been quiet for so long was already, slowly, beginning to change. 11,000 light-years away, in the Conclave session chamber, 31 species sat with the message in front of them and tried to agree on what came next. For the first time in centuries, none of them were entirely sure. And somehow, not one of them minded.